He thought coming home would bring only silence and memories. But when a veteran named Jack Harris returned to his father's old house by the sea, his loyal dog Rocky led him to a wall that hid more than dust and wood. Behind it lay a secret workshop, a story of love, sacrifice, and a father's voice carved into every piece of timber. What if the things you never understood about someone you loved were waiting quietly to be found? Sit back, take a deep breath, and enjoy this story of faith, family, and redemption. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The summer air along the Maine coast was warm and dry, carrying the faint scent of salt and pine. The sky stretched wide and pale blue, and the waves below struck the rocky shore with a slow and steady rhythm. Gulls circled above the dunes, their cries cutting through the quiet afternoon as the old pickup truck rumbled up the narrow coastal road. Jack Harris sat behind the wheel, his weathered hands gripping it loosely. He was 35 years old, lean and broad-shouldered, his skin tanned and rough from years spent under desert suns. His face carried the marks of both wind and war. Short brown hair brushed back from a strong forehead, and a faint beard framed his square jaw. There was a tiredness about him, the kind that does not come from lack of sleep, but from years of carrying too much. His eyes were a deep gray, calm but distant, always searching the horizon as if expecting danger to rise from the calmest sea. In the passenger seat sat Rocky, a large German shepherd with a sable coat of black and tan. He was 8 years old, strong but showing the first threads of silver around his muzzle. His amber eyes were sharp and intelligent, scanning the world outside as if it were a mission he had never stopped serving. A faded leather collar hung around his neck, and every now and then his ears would twitch at the sound of the sea breeze. Rocky had once been a military working dog, trained to detect explosives and sense human emotion. He had saved lives and carried silence like his own badge of honor. Jack glanced at him. "Good boy," he murmured under his breath, though his lips barely moved. Rocky lifted his head briefly, met his eyes, and then rested it back on his paws. The unspoken bond between them was old and solid. In the worst years, when sandstorms howled and the world burned red with fire and dust, it had been Rocky who kept Jack alive. Not by fighting, but by staying close, by reminding him what loyalty meant when everything else was lost. Now, the hum of the tires filled the air. The road wound along the coastline, flanked by dry grass and pale gray fences eaten by salt. Jack had not driven this way in 15 years. Each turn of the wheel carried him deeper into memories he had tried to leave buried. The house awaited him ahead, the last thing his father had left behind. When the war ended, Jack had tried many things. He had worked in warehouses, fixed fishing nets, even spent a short time driving long haul trucks. None of it felt like purpose. The discipline of the military had shaped him too strongly. He had learned to follow orders, to endure, to bury grief in silence. Those habits clung to him like a second skin. The news of his father's death had arrived quietly, in the form of a short letter written by a neighbor. His father, Thomas Harris, had been a fisherman for most of his life, a man of few words and many routines. He had lived alone since Jack's mother died when Jack was 16. Their relationship had withered after that, both men retreating into their own silences until there was nothing left but distance. Jack had not spoken to him in over a decade. When he read the letter, there had been no tears, only a dull weight in his chest that he could not name. The truck finally turned onto a narrow gravel path that sloped down toward the water. The engine coughed once and quieted as Jack stopped before the old house. The structure stood on a rise of land, its paint long stripped by sun and sea wind. The roof sagged slightly at the corners, and the porch railing leaned under the weight of years. Windows stared out over the water, dull and clouded with salt. The place looked smaller than he remembered, more fragile, as if the ocean itself had been slowly wearing it down. Jack stepped out and stretched, his boots crunching on gravel. The dry air carried the smell of seaweed and hot wood. Rocky jumped down beside him, shaking himself once and sniffing the ground with purpose. The sound of the waves drifted up the bluff like an old song. For a long while, Jack simply stood there, watching the sea. This had once been the view of his childhood. Endless water meeting endless sky. He had run along that beach when his mother was still alive, collecting shells while his father repaired nets on the porch. It had been a simple life, but even then, there had been silence. His father was not cruel, just unreachable, as if part of him was always somewhere beyond the horizon. After his mother died, that silence turned into a wall. At 16, Jack had joined the army, mostly to escape it. He thought he would never come back. He walked slowly to the porch. The boards creaked under his weight, but held firm. Under the first step, he reached down and felt for the loose stone. The key was still there, wrapped in a strip of old cloth. Some habits, he thought, never change. He unlocked the door and pushed it open. The air inside was thick with dust and the faint scent of old wood. Light filtered through the shutters in thin golden lines. Everything was exactly as he remembered it. The same worn armchair near the window. The same table scarred by years of use. On the mantel above the cold fireplace stood a single framed photograph of his mother, her smile bright and her eyes gentle. He felt the faint pull of guilt, sharp and sudden, for all the years he had stayed away. Rocky padded through the doorway, sniffing carefully around the room, his tail low but steady. Jack dropped his duffel bag by the door and rubbed the back of his neck. He felt the tension of being both visitor and heir, the unease of stepping into a memory made solid. He walked to the kitchen. The sink was empty, but the faucet dripped slowly. A cup still sat on the counter, clean but upside down as if waiting. The refrigerator was unplugged, and the smell of stale air made him grimace. He opened the small window above the sink. Warm wind rolled in, carrying the cry of gulls and the sound of the surf below. He turned back toward the living room and sat down in his father's chair. The fabric was rough under his hands, faded to the color of dry rope. From this spot, he could see the ocean through the front window, just as his father had. For a moment, he tried to picture the old man sitting here, staring at that same horizon, listening to the same endless rhythm of the waves. But the image would not come together. His father had always been a mystery, wrapped in silence. Rocky came to rest at his feet, his head heavy on Jack's boot. The dog's breathing was steady, grounding. Jack leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The quiet pressed against him until he could almost hear the ticking of his own heartbeat. It was strange how the house, empty and unmoving, seemed more alive than many of the places he had been. It had its own pulse, faint but constant. He thought of the letter again. The neighbor had written that his father's heart had simply stopped one morning. Peaceful, she had said. Jack wondered what peace had meant for a man like that. Did he think of his son in those final moments? Did he forgive him? Did he expect him to return? The questions tangled in his mind with no answers. Outside, the sunlight shifted, turning golden as the afternoon drifted toward evening. Jack stood and walked to the front door. The wind lifted his hair and brought the scent of salt stronger than before. Down below, the tide was coming in, brushing the rocks with white foam. He felt the strange pull of memory again, not painful this time, just heavy. Rocky stood beside him, ears perked toward the sea. The dog's fur shimmered in the light, and his steady presence made Jack feel, for the first time in years, that he was not completely alone. He reached down, letting his hand rest on Rocky's neck. "We made it back," he said quietly. The words felt foreign on his tongue, like something long forgotten. Rocky looked up at him with calm amber eyes, and in that gaze, Jack felt something loosen inside him. The road behind was done. Whatever came next would begin here, in the house that time had left untouched, with the sound of waves as the only witness. The sky deepened into a warm amber hue, the color of fading sun on wood and water. Jack closed the door gently and leaned against it, breathing in the dry air of the house. There was work to do, he knew. Repairs, cleaning, decisions about what to keep and what to let go. But for now, he simply stood there, surrounded by the echoes of the past and the steady heartbeat of the sea beyond the walls. The silence was no longer just emptiness. It was the beginning of something he could not yet name. The afternoon sun shone through the salt-specked window and poured a warm light into the living room. The air was dry and carried the faint scent of seaweed and pine resin from the trees beyond the dunes. The dust particles in the air drifted lazily like tiny gold flakes, and the slow hum of the ocean filled the silence of the house. It was a quiet summer day, the kind that made time move slower than thought itself. Jack Harris stood in the center of the old living room, with his sleeves rolled up and a damp cloth in one hand. The room looked smaller than he remembered from his childhood. The faded curtains hung limp and discolored by the years. The floorboards creaked under his boots, and a thin layer of dust coated everything like an old memory refusing to leave. Against one wall stood the heavy bookshelf that his father had built decades ago. It was filled with worn manuals about fishing and carpentry, and tucked among them were a few paperback novels his mother once loved. Jack touched the spines gently, feeling the roughness of the wood beneath the paint that had long lost its shine. Rocky was circling the room with the steady patience of a soldier. His paws made soft tapping sounds on the wooden floor. Every few seconds, he would pause and sniff the air, his ears twitching toward something unseen. His fur gleamed under the golden light, and his tail moved slowly, as if keeping rhythm with the sound of the waves outside. Jack smiled faintly at him, then bent down to move an old crate toward the doorway. The air smelled of dust and sea salt, and his shirt clung to his back with sweat. He took a step back and looked around. There was something both peaceful and heavy about the room. It was filled with silence that carried weight. Each object felt like it had a memory attached to it. The armchair where his father used to sit faced the window that looked toward the horizon. Beside it sat a small table with a half-burned candle still standing in a rusty holder. Jack wondered when his father had last lit it. He tried to picture the man sitting there alone through the long summer evenings, staring out at the empty sea, waiting for a voice that never came. Jack moved to wipe the dust off the bookshelf. His hand brushed over a framed photograph tucked between the books. It was his mother, standing by the pier, with her dark hair blowing in the wind and a wide smile on her face. She had been a small woman with soft features, gentle eyes, and the kind of warmth that filled a room. He could barely remember the sound of her laughter, but the image still hurt in a tender way. He placed the picture back carefully and wiped the top of the shelf. Rocky gave a low whine from behind him. Jack turned. The dog was standing near the back corner of the room beside the bookshelf. His nose was pressed close to the base of the wall, and he was sniffing hard, tail held straight. Jack frowned. "What is it, boy?" he said quietly out of habit, though the words carried no command. Rocky tapped the floor twice with his paw, then moved a few inches to the left and began to scratch lightly at the wooden paneling. The sound was faint but persistent. Jack walked over, his boots creaking on the floor. He knelt down beside Rocky and placed his palm on the wood. The surface felt cool, smoother than the rest of the wall. He knocked once with his knuckle. A hollow sound answered back. He moved a little to the side and tried again. This time the thud was solid, dull, like wood backed by stone. He returned to the first spot and knocked once more. The difference was clear. "Hollow here," he muttered under his breath. He straightened slowly, running his hand along the wall. The wood panels were slightly wider here, as if an extra layer had been added long after the rest of the room was built. The color was almost the same, but the pattern of the grain was faintly misaligned. A carpenter's eye would have noticed it at once. Jack felt a small current of curiosity stir in his chest. Rocky sat down, watching him carefully. The dog tilted his head, ears pricked forward, waiting for his next move. Jack smiled faintly. "You always see things first, don't you?" he said softly. The dog blinked and gave a single wag of his tail. Jack pushed the bookshelf aside, grunting as the old wood scraped across the floor. The effort sent up a puff of dust that made him cough. When the shelf was clear, he stood facing the wall again. Behind where the shelf had stood, the wood looked newer, less faded by sunlight. He ran his fingers along the seams, finding no visible hinges or handles. Whoever had built this part of the wall had done it with precision. He went to the small storage room next to the kitchen and found an old hammer, its handle worn smooth from use. The tool had belonged to his father. He turned it in his hands for a moment, feeling the weight, imagining the countless times those same hands had gripped it. There was something strange about holding it now, as if the distance between them had narrowed for the first time in years. Returning to the living room, Jack knelt by the wall again. He tapped gently with the hammer handle, moving from one board to another, listening to the changes in sound. Most of the wall was solid, but the section near the corner gave off that same hollow echo. He pressed his palm against it and felt the faint vibration under the wood. His heart began to beat faster, not from fear, but from an unease he could not name. The discovery made the air feel heavier. What would his father have hidden behind a wall? It was not like him to conceal things. The man had always been plain, his life built from the sea and the work of his hands. Jack leaned his forehead lightly against the panel and exhaled. Maybe it was nothing, just an old repair, or an added support beam. Still, something about the sound stayed in his mind. He rose and opened the window. Warm wind rolled through the room, lifting the curtains and carrying the smell of salt and wildflowers. Outside, the sea glimmered with the gold of the setting sun. For a moment, he let the light wash over him. He had not felt sunlight like this during his years in Iraq, where the heat had been cruel and the brightness carried danger. Here, it was softer. But even in peace, he found it difficult to let his guard down. His shoulders remained tense, his movements cautious. The war had taught him to read silence as a warning. He turned back to the wall. The boards were quiet now, unassuming, yet he could not shake the feeling that something waited behind them. He traced a finger over the wood, noticing faint scratches near the bottom, as though something had once been moved in and out. The marks were old, barely visible under the dust. Rocky stood beside him again, tail flicking once. The dog pressed his nose against the wall, then sat down, as if marking the spot for later. Jack crouched beside him and rubbed his ear. "We will look at it tomorrow," he said quietly. Rocky leaned into his hand, his eyes calm and trusting. The house had grown darker as the sun dipped lower. The sounds of the evening arrived slowly, the distant call of a seabird, the whisper of the wind through the open window, and the low hum of the waves. Jack looked around the room again. It felt less empty now, as if the walls themselves had started to breathe again after years of stillness. He gathered the cleaning cloths and set them on the counter. His muscles ached pleasantly from the work. There was satisfaction in doing something simple with his hands, even if the house still carried too much silence. He poured himself a glass of water and sat by the window, watching the orange light fade into pale gray. His thoughts drifted to his father. He tried to remember his voice, but could only recall gestures, the nod of his head, the rough calloused hands that had smelled of fish and salt. There had been so many things left unsaid between them. Jack wondered what it might have been like if they had known how to speak to each other. Maybe the wall in the living room was not the only one his father had built. Rocky lay stretched on the floor, his chest rising and falling slowly. Jack reached down and let his fingers rest on the dog's back, feeling the warmth of life beneath the fur. Tomorrow, he thought, he would find out what was behind that hollow sound. But for tonight, it was enough to sit in the quiet and listen to the sea. The rhythm of the waves matched the slow beating of his heart. Outside, the last trace of daylight slipped below the horizon, leaving the house bathed in soft twilight and the scent of the dry summer wind. The night air along the Maine coast was dry and cool. The wind carried the scent of salt and the low, steady hum of waves breaking against the rocks. Through the open window of the living room, a faint silver light from the half-moon spread across the floorboards, tracing the outlines of furniture like a memory that refused to fade. Jack Harris stood near the wall where Rocky had been restless all day. The silence inside the house was deep, broken only by the occasional creak of wood and the sound of the sea beyond. The day's work had left him tired, but his mind would not quiet. Every time the wind passed through the open window, it seemed to whisper across the room, brushing against the wooden panels where that strange hollow sound had come from. He had tried to tell himself it was nothing, maybe an old air pocket or a forgotten repair, but the thought kept returning. The wall was too thick, the sound too distinct. As he stared at it now, under the dim light of the single lamp, unease mixed with a quiet curiosity. Rocky lay by the armchair, his large body stretched across the floor, but his ears twitched at every small noise. The dog's instincts were still sharp. Even in rest, he was alert. His coat glistened faintly in the moonlight, shades of black and tan blending with the shadows. When the wind rattled the shutters, he lifted his head and gave a low growl deep in his throat. "Easy, boy," Jack murmured, though his own voice carried tension. He set down the old hammer he had brought from the tool shed earlier. The metal head was scarred and rusted, the wooden handle worn smooth from years of use. It had belonged to his father, like everything else in this house. Holding it made Jack feel as if his father were still present, silent but watchful. He crouched by the wall and pressed his hand flat against it. The wood was cool under his palm. He knocked once, softly. The hollow echo answered immediately, distinct and deep. He moved his hand a few inches to the left and knocked again. The sound was solid. The difference was clear and undeniable. Rocky got up and came to stand beside him. The dog's nose pressed close to the seams between the planks. He sniffed the air and let out a quiet whine, the same sound he had made earlier that afternoon. Jack rubbed the back of his neck and sighed. His pulse was steady, but he felt that peculiar stillness that came before every discovery. The same calm focus he used to feel before breaching a locked door overseas. He fetched a flashlight from his duffel bag and switched it on. The beam cut through the dim room and cast long shadows across the wall. He studied the surface closely. The boards here were smoother, slightly newer, as if they had been added later. Dust had gathered in the seams, but when he brushed it away with his fingers, he noticed faint nail marks that looked different from the rest. "All right," he whispered, mostly to himself. "Let's see what you are hiding." He wedged the edge of the hammer, claw into the thin gap between two boards, and pushed gently. The wood resisted at first, groaning softly. Then one nail popped free with a sharp metallic sound. The noise echoed through the quiet house and seemed to hang in the air. Rocky stood motionless beside him, eyes fixed on the movement of his hands. Jack pried another board loose. Dust cascaded down in fine sheets, coating his arms and the floor beneath him. The smell that followed was old and dry, a mix of wood and salt, the scent of years sealed away. He coughed once and wiped his sleeve across his mouth. The air felt different now, heavier, as if something long forgotten had just awakened. He removed one more board and leaned back to catch his breath. Through the narrow opening, he could see darkness, thick and unmoving. He lifted the flashlight and aimed it inside. The beam revealed a small empty space between the walls, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The inner wood was pale and dry, untouched by air or light for decades. And in the center of that hidden space, half concealed by shadows, was the faint outline of a wooden door. Jack froze. For a moment, he could hear nothing but the blood in his ears and the distant crash of waves outside. The door was small, perhaps no taller than his chest, built of the same kind of pine as the rest of the house, but darker with age. There was no handle, only a small iron latch, almost invisible under the dust. He stared at it, feeling the weight of time pressing down. Why would his father build a wall to hide a door? What could be behind it? The questions rose quickly, but he forced himself to breathe slowly. His father had been a man of habits, not secrets. The discovery felt wrong, like opening someone's diary without permission. Yet the curiosity burned stronger than hesitation. He reached forward and touched the edge of the door. The wood felt dry, splintered, and cold. He hesitated again. For years he had believed there was nothing left in this house worth finding. Now it seemed the walls themselves had been keeping something from him. Rocky's low whine broke the silence. The dog shifted closer, pressing his body against Jack's leg. His ears were up, but his tail remained still. He was calm, not frightened, only waiting. Jack looked down at him. "You found it," he said quietly. The dog blinked, his amber eyes catching the reflection of the flashlight. Jack placed his hand on the thick fur between his shoulders. He crouched again and examined the latch more closely. The metal was rusted, but intact. He tried to lift it with his fingers. It resisted, stiff with age, then gave way with a faint creak. The sound made his heart skip. He exhaled slowly, feeling sweat gather on his forehead, even though the air was cool. He did not open the door. Not yet. He sat back on his heels and let the silence fill the space again. Through the open window, he could hear the sea rising with the tide, the rhythmic crash of water against rock. The sound was steady, grounding. In that moment, Jack felt the strange collision of two worlds. The disciplined soldier within him wanted to act, to push forward, to complete the discovery. But another part of him, the son who had once lived in this house, hesitated. His father's memory hung heavy here, and the thought of tearing into something the old man had chosen to seal filled him with unease. He turned off the flashlight for a moment and sat in the darkness. The faint glow from the moon traced along the edge of the wall, catching on the dust that still hung in the air. Rocky shifted beside him and lay down again, head resting on his paws, but eyes still fixed on the opening. Jack could feel the warmth of the dog's body near his arm, steady and grounding. He stayed like that for a long time. The night deepened around them, filled with the quiet sound of the waves and the soft rustle of the curtains in the breeze. The smell of dry wood mixed with salt and memory. Jack thought of his father again. The man had always kept things to himself. Maybe this hidden room was another way of speaking, a message carved into wood instead of words. At last, Jack stood. His knees cracked softly. He replaced the hammer on the floor and leaned the removed boards neatly against the wall. The opening gaped dark and silent behind him. He switched off the lamp and stood in the center of the room once more. The air felt cooler now, touched by the sea breeze coming through the open window. Rocky came to his side and sat down, eyes bright even in the dim light. Jack rested his hand on his head. "We will see tomorrow," he said in a low voice. Rocky's tail brushed the floor once in answer. As he turned off the flashlight, the beam slid across the floor and caught the photograph of his mother on the shelf. Her smile glimmered faintly in the half-light before the room went dark again. The hidden door behind the wall remained silent, waiting. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the steady rhythm of the waves against the shore. The night settled around them like a breath held in the chest of the old house. Jack closed the window halfway to soften the sound of the wind. He looked around one last time before heading toward the small guest room at the end of the hall. The boards beneath his feet creaked softly in protest. He left the flashlight on the table by the wall, pointing toward the hollow space, its beam dimming slowly as the battery faded. Lying in bed later, Jack could still smell the dry wood and salt on his hands. His mind replayed the hollow sound of the hammer against the wall, the faint echo that had started it all. His father's voice, long absent, seemed to whisper somewhere inside that silence. The thought stayed with him until sleep finally came, slow and uneasy, with the steady breathing of Rocky beside the bed and the endless sea whispering beyond the windows. The morning sun drifted slowly across the main coastline, spilling warm light through the salt-stained windows of the old house. The air was dry and still, carrying the faint scent of pine and the sea. Gulls moved lazily above the cliffs, their cries echoing against the quiet rhythm of waves below. Inside the house, the dust from last night's discovery still hung faintly in the air, a soft golden mist in the light of dawn. Jack Harris stood by the wall that now gaped open, the removed planks stacked neatly beside him. He had slept little. Thoughts of what lay behind that small wooden door had chased him through the night. Now, in the full light of day, it felt less like a secret and more like an invitation. Rocky sat beside him, tail still, eyes fixed on the opening. The dog's calm. Patience steadied Jack's own breathing. He reached for the small latch again. It moved easily this time, as though the wood itself had decided to yield. When the door opened, the smell that rose was different from the rest of the house. It was dry, clean, touched with the faint resin of old pine and the lingering sweetness of oil polish. The air inside had been trapped for decades, yet carried no decay, only stillness. Jack lifted the flashlight and shone it through the narrow doorway. The beam struck wood, shelves, and the faint shimmer of metal. He widened the door and stepped inside. The space was larger than he had expected, perhaps 12 feet across, a hidden workshop, carved into the very bones of the house. Light filtered weakly through a small glass panel near the ceiling, painting the room in a pale amber glow. Every surface was tidy, almost deliberate. Tools hung from the walls in straight rows, their steel heads dulled but spotless. A lathe stood in one corner, its handles smooth from use. Jars of nails and screws lined a narrow shelf, labeled in his father's careful handwriting. The scent of dried pine sap mixed with linseed oil filled the room, sharp but comforting. Jack stood silently for a long moment, taking it all in. He could feel the presence of his father here more than anywhere else in the house. The order, the precision, the quiet, it was all him. Thomas Harris had been a fisherman by trade, but here behind a sealed wall, he had been something else entirely, an artist of wood. Rocky entered the room behind him, his paws making soft sounds on the wooden floor. He sniffed at the corners, tail swaying once, then settled near the doorway as if keeping watch. Jack smiled faintly. "You always keep guard, don't you?" he said softly. The dog's ear twitched in reply. Jack moved deeper into the room. A long workbench stood against the back wall, covered in a thin layer of dust that sparkled faintly in the light. Beneath it were drawers filled with chisels, clamps, brushes, and sandpaper, all arranged neatly as if waiting for their owner to return. He picked up one of the chisels and turned it in his hand. The wooden handle bore the faint imprint of fingers, strong, square, the kind that belonged to a man who worked hard and spoke little. He set it down gently. On the far end of the bench lay a single book, its leather cover darkened by age. He brushed away the dust and saw his father's name pressed faintly into the surface. It was a notebook, thick and bound with cord. He opened it carefully. Inside were pages of sketches and notes, furniture designs, measurements, and small written details about grain direction, joint strength, and wood finish. But as he turned the pages, the entries began to change. Midway through the book, the handwriting grew smaller, less mechanical, more human. Among the measurements were sentences that did not belong to any design. Simple lines, written in the same careful hand. The sea takes everything, but the hands still build. I dream of her voice when the tide is high. He has gone to war, and I did not say the words I should have. Jack stared at the lines, the words blurring for a moment. He could hear his own pulse heavy in his ears. His father had written these alone here in this secret space. They were not the words of a craftsman, but of a man who had lost too much. He turned another page. There was a sketch of a woman standing by a window, her hair tied loosely, a soft smile drawn with care. His mother. The drawing was simple, but full of life. Beneath it, in faint pencil, was written, "For her hands that built warmth from emptiness." Jack traced the outline with his finger. His throat tightened. He had not seen that kind of tenderness in his father's eyes since before she died. Rocky's quiet breath filled the silence behind him. Jack looked around the workshop again, noticing how each tool had been cleaned and hung precisely. His father had spent countless hours here, hiding in plain sight, creating beauty that no one ever saw. It was strange to think that while Jack had been halfway around the world, his father had been carving shapes into wood to fill the same silence. On a shelf above the bench stood several small wooden figures. He lifted one, a carving of a whale breaching the sea. The lines were smooth, almost alive, the detail in its fins delicate and true. He held it up to the light, seeing the marks of his father's blade, each stroke deliberate and calm. It was work done by a man seeking peace. Jack set the figure down and closed the notebook. He sat on the small stool beside the bench, resting his elbows on his knees. The room felt warm despite the shadows. The scent of pine was everywhere, mixed with dust and time. For the first time since returning home, he felt something close to understanding. His father had not been distant because he lacked love. He had been quiet because love had hurt too deeply. He thought of the years between them, the arguments that never happened, the letters that were never sent. He remembered leaving at 18, the door closing behind him, and never turning back. The silence had followed him to every place he went. And here, in this workshop, that same silence had shaped wood instead of breaking people. Rocky shifted, letting out a small huff before lying down fully, chin on his paws. Jack glanced at him and smiled faintly. Even the dog seemed to sense the weight of this place. He stood again and walked to the center of the room. On the far wall, beneath a window covered in dust, hung a framed piece of wood, a plaque carved with words. The letters were simple, but carefully made. Measure twice, cut once, and listen to the quiet. Jack read the words slowly. They felt less like a craftsman's saying and more like advice for life. He ran his fingers along the carved edges. The grooves were deep, firm, the work of steady hands. His father had carved this alone, perhaps speaking to himself in the only language he knew. Jack stepped back and let out a slow breath. The noise of the world outside, the gulls, the surf, the rustle of wind, faded for a moment. He looked down at his own hands. They were rough, scarred from war and work, but steady, the same kind of hands. For years, he had believed he was nothing like his father. Now, in the quiet of this hidden room, he saw how wrong that had been. He closed the notebook and placed it back where he had found it. The dust rose and fell like a sigh. He turned toward the door. Rocky stood, stretching once before following. The light outside the small window had shifted, glowing warmer now, the color of late afternoon. Jack stepped back, through the narrow opening into the living room. The air there felt heavier, more ordinary. Behind him, the workshop waited, silent but no longer forgotten. He replaced one of the boards loosely over the gap, not to hide it, but to protect it. Some places he thought should remain quiet for a little longer. As he stood looking out the window toward the sea, he felt something change inside him. The tide rolled in slowly, brushing against the rocks, and the house creaked softly as if it too could breathe again. The afternoon light outside the old house was warm and steady. The sea breeze carried a faint scent of salt and dry grass, and the waves rolled toward the shore in soft, repeating patterns. The air was quiet except for the cry of a gull that drifted through the open window. Inside the small, hidden workshop, time seemed to hold still. Jack Harris sat at the wooden workbench, the same one where his father's tools still lay arranged in perfect order. The smell of pine resin and oil hung around him, like a memory that would never fade. The notebook he had found earlier lay open before him. Its pages were rough at the edges, corners curled, the ink faint but still legible. He turned them slowly, each one revealing fragments of his father's world, measurements, designs, words half-written and crossed out. Rocky sat nearby, his head resting on his paws, watching quietly. The dog's calm presence was a steady rhythm in the background, like the sea itself. Occasionally he lifted his head, sniffed the air, and sighed, as if he too felt the weight that filled the room. Jack's eyes moved across a familiar sketch of a chair, then a table, then a small drawing of the boat his father once owned, the Sea Wind. The lines were sharp, precise, and beneath it a few notes written in his father's careful handwriting. He turned the page, and something slipped out, a folded piece of paper, yellowed and fragile with time. He picked it up gently. His fingers hesitated before unfolding it. The top bore the words, "Bill of Sale, Vessel, Sea Wind." The date struck him first. It was from the same summer he had been 18, the same year he had crashed his old truck on the North Road, the same year everything had fallen apart. He remembered the accident too clearly, the screech of tires, the sickening jolt, the smell of burnt rubber. A friend had been injured. The truck had been destroyed. The debt that followed had been more than a boy could pay. His father had said little then, only nodded when Jack tried to speak, his expression unreadable. Jack had thought the silence meant disappointment, even contempt. He had joined the army soon after, driven by guilt as much as pride. Now he stared at the paper in his hands. His father had sold his boat that same month. The Sea Wind had been his livelihood, the vessel he had spent half his life repairing and sailing. Jack could still picture it, a narrow blue hull with a white stripe and a small cabin smelling of rope and salt. The boat had been his father's world. To sell it was to surrender everything. Jack turned the page in the notebook and found another paper folded neatly behind it. This one was a bank record showing a loan taken in his father's name. The handwriting confirmed it. Thomas Harris, amount paid in full within a year. Jack's chest tightened as the truth came together in his mind. His father had sold the boat and borrowed money to pay off the damage from the accident. He had never told him. He had carried the debt alone and kept his silence for the rest of his life. The room seemed to tilt for a moment. Jack leaned back, staring at the papers in his hands. The sounds of the sea outside grew sharper, the waves striking the rocks like a pulse. He thought of his father out there on the docks after the sail, watching someone else sail away on the sea wind. The image cut deep. He stood and walked to the window. The late sunlight hit the water, turning it to silver. His reflection appeared faintly in the glass. The face of a man grown older than his father had been when he last saw him. His eyes burned, not from tears, but from the weight of understanding. Rocky rose and came to stand beside him. The dog pressed his head gently against Jack's hand, the gesture simple and grounding. Jack stroked his fur absently, feeling the rough warmth of it beneath his palm. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "All these years I thought he said nothing because he did not care." His voice broke slightly, but it was because he cared too much. The realization hurt and healed at the same time. He could see now how wrong he had been, how silence had been his father's only language of love. The old man had never known how to speak the words. Instead, he had worked, endured, and sacrificed quietly. Jack sat down again at the workbench. The papers lay before him, fragile yet solid proof of everything his father had done. He thought about how different his life might have been if he had known this sooner. He might have written, might have come home before it was too late. Regret rose like a tide, but beneath it, there was something steadier, gratitude. He traced a finger over the name written on the sale document. The ink was faded, but the letters were clear. Thomas Harris, his father's name, simple and strong. He folded the paper carefully and slid it back into the notebook where it had been kept all these years. Outside, the sound of the waves grew softer as the tide began to fall. The house creaked gently in the shifting wind. Jack looked around the workshop, taking in every detail: the tools, the carvings, the small, unfinished projects. This room was his father's true confession, made not in words, but in wood. Every mark of the chisel, another line in a story of quiet endurance. Rocky moved closer and sat by his chair. The dog looked up at him, eyes calm, reflecting the faint golden light. Jack reached down and scratched behind his ears. "You were lucky," he murmured. "You never have to guess what love means." He leaned back in the chair, his body heavy, but his mind strangely clear. For the first time in years, the silence did not feel empty. It was full of meaning, full of all the things that had been left unsaid, but not unlived. The sea breeze slipped through the crack of the door, stirring the dust on the workbench. The smell of pine oil lingered, gentle and clean. Jack closed his eyes and listened. The waves, the wind, and the steady breathing of Rocky filled the room like a rhythm older than memory. When he opened his eyes again, the sun was dipping lower, spilling soft orange light through the small workshop window. He stood slowly, placing one hand on the workbench as if to steady himself. Then he turned toward the door. He would leave the workshop just as it was. Some truths were meant to stay in the quiet. Before he stepped out, he looked once more at the notebook resting on the table. His father's world, carved and written in silence, would stay here, but the understanding it carried would go with him. Jack closed the door gently behind him. The faint creak of hinges sounded like a sigh. In the living room, the light had changed, and the smell of salt filled the air. He walked to the window and stood for a long time watching the horizon fade into gold. Somewhere beyond the waves, the sea wind still lived in his memory, sailing under another man's name, carrying the love of a father who never said goodbye. The afternoon was still and heavy with the scent of salt and pine. The sunlight streamed through the high window of the workshop, soft and golden, turning the dust in the air into tiny floating embers. Outside the house, the waves moved with slow rhythm against the rocks, while gulls circled lazily above the shore. Inside, the world felt unchanged, sealed in time. Jack Harris stood in the doorway of the hidden workshop. The notebook lay closed on the bench where he had left it, and the silence that filled the room was deeper now, as if it waited for him to uncover one more truth. Rocky padded quietly beside him, his nails clicking softly against the wood. The dog paused near a far corner, tail low, nose pressed toward a pile of old lumber covered with a heavy canvas cloth. Jack followed his gaze. The corner had been shadowed earlier, and he had not noticed anything unusual there before. Rocky gave a low sound in his throat and looked back at him expectantly. Jack walked over, his boots echoing faintly in the confined space. The smell of walnut and oil polish grew stronger as he reached the corner. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the cloth, sensing that whatever lay beneath it had been waiting for him for a long time. He pulled the canvas back slowly. A puff of fine dust rose into the light. Beneath it stood a cradle made of dark walnut wood, the surface smooth but unfinished at the edges. Its curves were graceful, the shape both sturdy and gentle, like something built by hands that understood care. The headboard was carved with small, delicate figures of whales swimming through waves, their bodies following the grain of the wood as if alive. Jack bent closer. Along the inside rail, carved in thin, neat letters, were the words, "For my son's child." The sight stopped his breath. He reached out and touched the carving with the tips of his fingers. The letters were clean, but slightly uneven near the end, as though the hands that had shaped them had begun to tremble. The last lines of the waves near the base were shallow and rough, left incomplete. The work had ended abruptly, frozen in the middle of love and time. He could almost see his father here, sitting where he now stood, the lamp burning low, the sound of the sea faint through the boards. The man's shoulders slightly hunched, his large weathered hands guiding the chisel with slow precision. The quiet concentration, the patience that only years of solitude could teach. He would have been older then, his hair gone gray, his back stiff from years on the docks. The hands that once hauled nets and ropes now turning gently over the delicate lines of wood, meant for a grandchild he might never meet. Jack felt his throat tighten. He traced the unfinished edge of the wood where the carving had stopped. The surface there was rough under his fingertips, the tool marks shallow and hesitant. The old man had been losing strength, perhaps his sight or steadiness. Yet he had kept working, shaping the dream of a future that never came. He lowered himself to sit beside the cradle, his knees brushing the dusty floor. Rocky came closer and sat beside him, silent and watchful. The dog's dark eyes followed his movements, patient and full of understanding. Jack laid one hand on the cradle rail and the other on Rocky's head. The contrast between the warm, living fur and the cool, smooth walnut struck something deep within him. He remembered his father's silence at the dinner table, the long evenings when neither spoke. He had thought it coldness then. Now he saw it differently. It was a man waiting, holding on to a hope he could not voice. The cradle was proof of that hope, a dream carved into wood. Jack leaned forward, resting his forehead against the edge of the cradle. The faint scent of walnut oil and dust filled his senses. The wood was cool against his skin. His chest rose and fell slowly, and when he exhaled, he realized tears had begun to fall. They soaked into the grain of the wood, darkening it slightly, small marks that vanished as quickly as they came. He spoke quietly, his voice rough. "You were still building, even when I was gone. You still believed there would be something left of us." The words faded into the quiet air. Rocky nudged his arm gently, his nose cold against Jack's sleeve. The gesture was small but steady, grounding him in the moment. Jack wiped his face with the back of his hand and looked again at the cradle. It was beautiful, even in its incompleteness. The whales seemed to glide through their carved sea, the waves flowing toward the unworked end where the last cuts had faltered. He imagined his father pausing there, chisel in hand, realizing his fingers could no longer obey his will. The light from the small lamp flickering over the wood, the unfinished lines standing as a quiet admission of time's mercy and cruelty. He must have sat there a long time before finally setting the tools aside. Jack stood slowly and circled the cradle. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Every joint fitted perfectly, the curves of the rails polished to a satin sheen. Yet the imperfections at the end made it human. They made it his father's final message, carved not in strength, but in love that refused to stop. He thought of his own life then, of the years in uniform, the noise of the battlefield, the friends lost to dust and silence. He had built walls around himself, believing it was strength. Now, in this quiet workshop, surrounded by the scent of wood and the echo of another man's silence, he realized that love had always been there waiting, carved into the shape of something he had never thought to see. The light outside began to fade, turning gold and soft. Shadows stretched across the floor, climbing the walls until the workshop glowed like amber. Jack reached out once more and touched the carved whales. The surface was smooth beneath his calloused hand. He could feel his father in the grain, in every stroke that spoke of patience and faith. He whispered again, this time steady, "I see you now. I understand." The words hung in the air. The workshop seemed to breathe with him, its silence no longer cold, but warm and alive. Rocky shifted, laying his head on Jack's knee. The dog's steady breathing was the only sound for a long while. Jack stood and looked down at the cradle one last time. He knew he would never move it from this place. It belonged here, in the quiet heart of the house, where love had been carved in secret. He pulled the canvas back over it gently, smoothing the cloth with his hands. The outline of the cradle beneath the fabric looked soft and peaceful, as if finally at rest. He turned toward the doorway. The smell of the sea drifted in from beyond the walls, clean and cool. As he stepped out, the last light of day touched his face, and he felt the weight of years lift just enough for him to breathe freely. Behind him, the unfinished cradle waited in silence, a symbol of hope unspoken but never lost. The sun hung low over the Maine coastline, casting long streaks of gold across the sand and the weathered boards of the old house. The air was dry and heavy with the scent of salt and sawdust. The waves broke in slow rhythm beyond the dunes, their sound blending with the distant cries of gulls. A faint wind came through the open window, stirring the thin curtains and carrying the warmth of late summer. Jack Harris stood on the porch, his hands rough with work, his face browned by sun and wind. The months since he had uncovered his father's workshop had passed like a steady tide, each day shaping him in quiet ways. His eyes had deepened, the lines around them carved not by age, but by resolve. The house behind him was no longer silent. Every evening, the faint hum of tools and the smell of freshly cut wood drifted into the night. That morning, a black car had come down the dirt road, its tires crunching over gravel. A man in a dark suit had stepped out, tall, with a sharp jaw and thin lips that never seemed to smile. His name was Martin Graves, a local lender known across the county for his cold efficiency. He was in his 40s, his hair slicked back, his gray eyes hard and calm. There was no malice in his manner, only the detached confidence of a man who dealt in debt, not people. He had walked up to Jack with the air of someone approaching a foregone conclusion. "Mr. Harris, I believe you know why I am here." Jack had listened in silence as the man explained that the property's old debt still stood, that the land was worth little now, but the location was valuable, that he would take it off Jack's hands for a modest sum. Jack's reply had been quiet, but firm. "This house stays." The words had left no room for negotiation. Graves had studied him for a moment, his pale eyes narrowing slightly, then given a small nod. "You are welcome to make that mistake, Mr. Harris, but the sea has a way of erasing stubborn men." He had turned and left without another word, the black car disappearing down the dirt road in a cloud of dust. Now, hours later, Jack stood where the car had been, watching the horizon. The sun was slipping toward evening. Rocky lay nearby on the porch, his fur catching the golden light. The dog was still strong despite his age, his coat thick and his posture alert. He lifted his head slightly, eyes following the line of Jack's gaze, then rested it back on his paws. Jack looked down at his hands, still marked with faint cuts and calluses from the past weeks. Since finding the workshop, he had spent every night there, learning what his father had left behind. The first nights were clumsy, his cuts uneven, his hands unsure. But over time, the rhythm of the tools had become natural. The sound of the plane against the wood, the scent of sawdust in the air, the way light caught the shavings as they curled from the grain. It felt like coming home to something older than memory. During the day, he worked down at the docks, hauling crates of fish and mending nets for a small wage. The foreman, a broad man named Henry Lowe, with thick arms and kind eyes, had offered him the job without many questions. Henry was in his 50s, his beard streaked with gray, his laugh deep and rough from years of shouting over the wind. People said he had once been a fisherman who lost everything in a storm but never lost his sense of humor. Jack respected him for that. "You work hard," Henry had said one afternoon, handing Jack a bottle of water as they sat on the dock railing. "Most folks break before the sea does, but you just bend." Jack had smiled faintly. "The sea already took enough from me. I am done giving it more." In the evenings, Jack returned to the workshop. He would light the old lantern, open the window to let the sea breeze in, and set to work. Rocky always followed, curling up by the door as if guarding both the man and the memory that filled the room. The tools felt familiar now, as though his father's hands guided his own. He started small, carving simple shapes, then boxes, then small tables. The rhythm of creation steadied him, giving shape to days that might otherwise have blurred into solitude. One night, as the lamplight flickered, there had been a knock on the door. It was Mrs. Green from the village, a widow in her 60s who lived a mile inland. She was short and round, with silver hair, always tied in a bun, and a voice that carried warmth. She had brought a bundle of old wood wrapped in cloth. Thought you might make better use of it than I could, she said. Her smile had been shy, but kind. Behind her stood her grandson, Tommy, a boy of about 10, with freckles across his nose and a piece of string in his hand that he called a leash, though no animal followed. From that night on, others came. A carpenter named Bill, from the next town, brought spare nails and sandpaper. The old mailman left a set of chisels he no longer used. Even Henry stopped by one evening with a plank of cedar and a grin. The town had always known of Thomas Harris, the quiet fisherman. But now they learned of his son, who had returned and taken up the craft. Each evening, when the light faded and the tide began to rise, Jack worked until his arms ached. The air inside the workshop grew thick with the smell of wood and sweat. Rocky would lift his head occasionally, watching as shavings fell in curls across the floor. The steady sound of hammer and saw mixed with the whisper of the sea outside. The villagers began to pass by the house more often. At night, from the road, they could see the warm glow of the workshop window, a single light shining against the darkness. It became a quiet symbol, a reminder that something lost could still be rebuilt. Jack never spoke much about his plans, but as the weeks went by, the shape of his purpose became clearer. He was restoring not only his father's craft, but the dignity of the home itself. Each board he cut and every joint he fit seemed to mend something invisible inside him. One evening, when the wind turned cool, he stepped outside and looked toward the sea. The horizon was red with the last light of day. Rocky stood beside him, fur ruffled by the breeze. Jack rested a hand on the dog's head. "We are going to keep it," he said quietly. "The house, the workshop, everything." Rocky's tail brushed against his leg in response. Behind them, the workshop glowed with soft yellow light. The air was filled with the scent of wood and oil, the same scent that had surrounded his father years ago. The sea wind carried it through the open door, mingling with the smell of salt. For the first time in years, Jack felt peace not as a memory, but as something real. The night settled gently over the coast. The waves rolled on, the lantern flickered in the window, and the old house, once forgotten, stood alive again under the stars. The morning sky stretched wide and clear over the coast of Maine. The air was dry and warm, filled with the faint scent of salt and pine drifting from the dunes. The sea was calm, its surface catching the first light of day and scattering it in golden ripples. Gulls wheeled lazily above the cliffs, their calls echoing across the water. It was a summer morning that carried both peace and promise. Jack Harris sat on the porch steps of the restored house, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes following the slow rise of the sun. The light washed over his face, bringing out the roughness of his features, the lines cut by years of wind and war. His hair, once darker, now carried threads of gray at the temples, and his skin had taken the color of sun-warmed oak. His movements were slower these days, but sure, every gesture shaped by work and purpose. Beside him lay Rocky, the old German shepherd, whose fur gleamed bronze and black in the sunlight. His muzzle was graying now, and his ears twitched at the distant sounds of the sea. He lifted his head slightly, breathing in the morning air, then rested it again on his paws. Jack reached down and brushed his hand across the dog's neck, feeling the steady rhythm of life beneath the coarse fur. "You earned your rest, buddy," he murmured softly. It had been nearly a year since that first day he had stepped into his father's hidden workshop. The time since had reshaped everything, The once forgotten room was now alive again, filled with the hum of tools, the scent of varnish and sawdust, and the sound of creation. Jack had rebuilt every inch of it with his own hands, plank by plank, until the place stood strong and bright under the coastal sun. Where his father's old plaque once hung, the one that read, "Measure twice, cut once," Jack had added a new sign. It read, "Harris and Rocky Workshop." Beneath it, small words carved with care said woodwork and handcrafts for the shore. It was not grand, but it was honest. The villagers who had helped him rebuild now came by often, bringing work, laughter, and stories. Fishermen stopped to have their oars repaired. Mothers brought chairs with broken legs. Children pressed their faces to the open window to watch the shavings curl from the wood. Jack had learned quickly, his hands guided by the memory of his father's craft. He had finished the cradle first, sanding each curve until it shone like warm honey in the light. He placed it near the window of the workshop, where the sun could touch it each morning. He never spoke of it, but sometimes, when he worked late into the night, he would glance at it and feel that quiet connection to something larger than himself. Henry Lowe, the foreman from the docks, often visited after work. His heavy boots left marks on the porch, and his laugh filled the air before he even reached the door. The man had lost much in his life, but his spirit remained wide as the ocean. He would stand at the workshop door, arms crossed over his chest, watching Jack plane the wood. "Looks like you found your calling after all," he would say, his voice carrying both teasing and respect. Jack would nod, his lips curving into a quiet smile. "Guess it was here all along, waiting for me to stop running." Mrs. Green still came by once a week, usually bringing bread or jars of jam. She'd grown fond of sitting in the corner chair of the workshop, watching Jack work, while Tommy, her grandson, played with Rocky outside. The boy had grown taller, his freckles deepened by the sun. He had a knack for carving small pieces from scrap wood, his tongue poking out in concentration as he tried to mimic Jack's careful hands. Jack taught him little by little, patient and calm, as his father had once been in silence. As the weeks passed, the workshop became part of the village rhythm. Each morning, the smell of coffee and sawdust mingled with the salt air. The sound of hammering and sawing mixed with gulls and waves. Some evenings, when the work was done, Jack would bring a chair onto the porch, sit beside Rocky, and watch the light fade into the horizon. The house itself had changed. The cracks had been sealed, the walls painted in soft cream, and the windows polished until they reflected the sea like mirrors. Inside, the floors gleamed faintly in the sun. On one wall of the living room, Jack had hung his father's drawings, framed neatly in simple walnut frames. The once hidden door now stood open, leading to the workshop, as if the house itself had learned to breathe again. Every corner of the place carried memory. The smell of wood oil reminded him of his father's hands. The faint scratches on the workbench bore the proof of years gone by. Yet there was no sadness now, only peace. The man who had once returned from war, hollow and uncertain, now lived each day with quiet purpose. His life, once marked by loss, had found new meaning in creation. That morning, as he watched the sun climb higher, he heard the sound of footsteps on the path. It was Henry again, with his sleeves rolled up and his broad grin ready. "Morning, carpenter," he called out, holding a small bundle of rope. "Thought you might fix up a handle for my wife's old trunk." Jack stood, dusted off his jeans, and nodded. "Bring it in. I'll see what I can do." Henry laughed and followed him inside, the door swinging open to the smell of fresh pine. Rocky rose slowly, stretching his stiff legs before padding after them. His tail wagged once, slow but content. He settled near the doorway, his eyes half closed in the sunlight. The day moved on in quiet rhythm. Jack worked through the morning, the rasp of tools and the scent of sawdust filling the air. Henry talked and joked, his voice blending into the steady sound of waves outside. From the porch, Mrs. Green waved as she passed with Tommy, the boy, calling out a cheerful hello. Jack smiled and raised his hand in return. The world had grown simple again, bound by work, friendship, and the steady breath of the sea. By afternoon, the light turned warmer, spilling gold across the walls. The workshop glowed like amber, each dust mote catching the light as it drifted through the air. Jack set down his tools and looked around, his chest filled with something both heavy and light at once. He thought of his father, of the silence that had once haunted this house, and how that silence had now become song. When evening came, he returned to the porch. The horizon was painted with orange and violet. The sea stretched out calm and endless. Rocky settled beside him again, breathing slow and steady. Jack leaned back, the sound of the waves matching the rhythm of his heart. He had rebuilt what was lost, not just in wood, but in spirit. The sun slipped behind the edge of the world, and the first stars appeared. The workshop behind them glowed with the soft light of the lantern. The name carved on the sign outside caught the last touch of dusk. Harris and Rocky Workshop. Under the sky of summer, where the sea whispered against the sand and the wind carried the scent of pine, the house by the shore stood alive once more, a place where love, loyalty, and perseverance had found their home again. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt and sunlight across the porch as Jack watched another dawn rise over the horizon. The house that once held silence now breathed with life, filled with warmth, laughter, and the steady rhythm of work and love. It had become more than a home. It was proof that broken things could be rebuilt, that pain could be reshaped into purpose. Through loss, he had learned the language of gratitude. Through solitude, he had found his way back to grace. The people of the small village often said the light in Jack's window was like a star guiding ships at night. To them, it was not just a workshop. It was a reminder that one man's renewal could become hope for many. And to Jack, it was the legacy of a father who had spoken love not through words, but through the patience of his hands. Sometimes, when the sea was still and the sky burned gold, Jack felt something greater moving in the quiet. Maybe it was his father's spirit, or maybe it was the whisper of God himself. It reminded him that miracles are not always loud. Sometimes they come in the form of forgiveness, of new beginnings, of the courage to try again. To everyone who hears this story, let it be a reminder that no heart is too scarred to heal, and no home is too lost to be rebuilt. Keep faith even when the night feels long. Share kindness like sunlight, and hold on to the small miracles that visit your days. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need a sign of hope. Leave your thoughts below. Subscribe for more stories of faith and love, and may the Lord bless you and your loved ones with peace, strength, and light for every new morning.